Hello, my name is Tim Malone, and I'm a history teacher, and I'm doing a series of lectures on American history. And today's lecture is about a group of people who are often described as the first Americans, Native Americans. It seems only logical to start American history with Native Americans. But there's problems with American history and Native Americans. It's interesting, David Trower wrote a book called Res Life in 2012. And he kind of became the spokesman for Native Americans as a result of his book and articles that he wrote in newspapers and magazines about the same time period. And Trower says, to understand American Indians is to understand America. That's quite a statement. To understand American Indians, and Trower's a Native American, and note that he uses the term American Indians. To understand American Indians is to understand America. Quite a statement, but I think as we go along with this lecture, we'll begin to understand, or we'll begin to penetrate that statement, that rather broad, global statement. To understand American Indians is to understand America. So I like to start talking about Native Americans and American history by asking an introductory question, basic. How important are Native Americans in the history of the United States? How important are Native Americans in the history of the United States? Obviously, very important, essentially important, categorically important, and yet, how much time and space is given to Native Americans in the traditional account of American history? Now, when I was in 8th grade, textbook, chapter 1 was Christopher Columbus, the discovery of America in 1492. The European discovery of the Americas. Obviously an important turning point in world history. The discovery of the Americas for Western Europe. And the Native Americans play a role in the Columbus story, and our next lecture is going to be about Christopher Columbus, because he's such a famous figure in history and such a controversial figure. And it's sort of posited that the Native Americans welcomed Columbus, and Columbus thought of the Native Americans as his friends, and they got along. We'll find out that that's not really the way it went. Native Americans, how important are they? Absolutely important. No Native Americans and no United States as we know it. There's, as I've hinted at already, there's a Native American problem in the history of the United States. And the problem is that at this late date, can American history ever adequately incorporate Native Americans into the story, into the plot of the story? The problem of the other. It's a dilemma, and I struggle with it to this day. I'm a historian. I'm an American historian. And I think I give Native Americans the props they deserve for being very important players, essential. No Native Americans, no United States of America. And yet, I have my doubts about, even with my attempt to objectively incorporate Native Americans adequately into the storyline of American history that I just can't do it. Nobody can do it. Can Native Americans ever be adequately incorporated into the story of Western European, white, as it were, conquest, imperialism of them? Or are they perpetually assigned to the category of the other? They were in the traditional story. And like I said, in high school, the textbook starts with Columbus. Now, because there was a Native American rights movement in the 1960s and 1970s, because it became clear upon reflection that, wow, Native Americans played a crucial role in the development of the nation, that they should be given more space in textbooks. That was realized in the 60s and 70s and 80s and on up to today. And what happened? Well, these textbooks that I have, American history textbooks, freshman college level survey textbooks, almost all of them now, Columbus is chapter 2, right? In an effort to redress this injustice, this ignoring, this suppression of the importance of Native Americans to the development of the country, in order to redress that, historians in good faith have chapter 1 is now Native Americans. But it seems, I mean, yay, all right, but it seems so artificial. It seems like what the textbook publishers did was they stapled into chapter 1 about Native Americans that's pretty vague, pretty general, and then chapter 2, Columbus, oh, all right, now we're back on track. Now we're back on the story, right? Western European conquest of the Americans. And in that story, the traditional story, Native Americans are more like props. Native Americans are more like the opposition. They're more like in the category of high mountain ranges had to be climbed, raging rivers had to be forded, and Native Americans had to be defeated. They're sort of in the category of obstacles to the development and settlement of America by the real Americans, the white Western Europeans. It's a dilemma. And I don't know. I mean, I've often said, what would it be like to write a textbook solely from the point of view of Native Americans? And it would look quite a bit different than the textbooks that are still rolling off the presses today. And I'm not certain that I'm aware of a Native American history of the United States. There probably is some. You'd think I'd know. But there's a problem with Native Americans in history. And the Native American problem, how do you incorporate these very important people into the story where they've been alienated for so long? How do you solve that problem? And I don't know. It's a dilemma. It's a dilemma. A Native American could say to me, history teacher and historian, take your history and shove it. Your history has been death to my people. I don't want to be in your history. I don't want to be incorporated into your history books. Look's what's happened. Get you in your history. And what could I say? What can I say? You have my sympathy, but I have no solution to the dilemma. It calls into question the entire damn historiography of the United States and always will. No, there's got to be a solution. But I don't know what it is. They're stapling in a chapter 1, and then usually there's another chapter about Native Americans in the second half of American history, or the settlement of the West. they've stapled in a chapter about the Plains Indians in the history books there too. And so that's better than nothing, but it just seems so artificial. It's a dilemma. It's a dilemma. The second point I'd like to make about Native Americans and United States history is that the struggle is still going on. Now, Geronimo, the last renegade Indian, right, the Apache Geronimo, was captured in 1886. And most textbooks cover that and say, well, that's the end of the Indian Wars in America, 1886. No, it's still going on. The 500-year struggle. And the ongoing struggle is in the news. Now that you're hip to the importance of Native Americans and the dilemma that Native Americans present to the history of the United States, you'll see that Native Americans are in the news all the time, continuing the struggle. They're in court over land. They're in court over the disgraceful and undeniable breaking of treaties that were signed years ago. I mean, treaties that were just ignored. Yes, understand that the struggle between the invaders and the Native Americans, the indigenous people, continues to this day. And it's in the news, and it's very interesting to follow that news. Because again, it sort of brings you up to date. It brings you in to the discussion, to the dilemma. It's not over. Now here's another point I'd like to make about Native Americans, and this is a problematic point. Boy, everything about Native Americans concerning American culture and society and history is problematic. And I think you can tell that I'm a bit frustrated, right? Because historians want to objectively and adequately present the past. And despite my great sympathy and understanding for the plight, for the struggle of Native Americans, I can't solve the problem. I haven't solved the problem in my own mind. But here's a point. The appeal of Native American lifestyle or culture should not be underestimated. And what is that appeal? We're a mixed, Creole is the word they use, culture. And what role does that mixture play in the idea of American exceptionalism? Native American culture, or Native American cultures, still exist. And there's an entire industry in presenting that culture, or cultures, because there's dozens of Native American cultures, as something desirable, as something better than dominant U.S. culture. There's an alternative. So Native Americans have always presented an alternative to the dominant conqueror's culture. Some historians and commentators have said that that alternative is the reason that the dominant culture has so viciously attacked Native Americans and their culture. That the leadership of the dominant culture thinks that Native Americans' cultures could undermine, could supplant. I don't know about that interpretation myself, but it's interesting. And there's problems with the idea of subcultures. Again, that term is out of fashion now because subculture implies inferiority, right? Subculture. Let's call them alternative cultures. Now, there are many alternative cultures in the United States. There's a Jewish alternative culture. There's an Irish alternative culture. There's a Polish alternative culture, an Italian alternative culture, certainly an African American alternative culture, which is very powerful in entertainment and music and fashion. Alternative cultures. There's a Native American alternative culture that vies with. Now, of course, there's commentators, Native American commentators, that say that the idea of an alternative Native American culture is part of the process of domination and conquest. Get off that alternative Native American culture. I don't know. I mean, you see the alternative Native American culture often and everywhere in the United States. And there's an appeal to it, alternative, natural, native. Again, I talk myself into a corner because I don't know what to think about it. There's obviously hundreds, if not thousands, of Native Americans making their living off the alternative Native American culture. There are also Native Americans that again say, take this white man created alternative Native American culture and stuff it, baby. That's part of the problem. So I don't know. If, however, we're a mixture of European, not just European, African, Asian, and Native cultures, if we're an amalgamation, is that what makes us American? In other words, is Native Americanness at the heart of Americanness? See, what a morass. It's a morass. And nobody can agree. I shouldn't even gone down this path of an appealing Native American alternative and the role that that's played in the development of the broader American culture. Part of me is that the more Native American our culture becomes, the better for all Americans. That our Native American roots have been denied, and the rediscovery of them would be healing, would be cathartic, would be good for the overall culture. I don't know. Here's, I have here a piece from Mother Jones, Land of the Munchkins, where they talk about the appeal of Native American culture around the world. And what they have here is they have that there are societies in Germany where people spend their spare time and their spare money, their weekends. They go off and dress up and play Native American in Germany. There's people like that in Russia, Sweden, all over, Japan. All over the world, there are hobbyists who reenact, play act, being Native Americans. So again, what's the appeal? And you could say it's all a mistake, right? It's all a subterfuge. It's all a method of domination. But I don't know. I don't know. Again, personally, I think that the more we realize as Americans our native roots, the better off we'd be. There's something there, but I don't know if I can put my finger on it. So another point, dovetailing off what we were just talking about, American culture is more Native American than most Americans have been led to believe. The contribution of Native Americans to American history, American culture, has been downplayed, systematically, on purpose, downplayed. Now, this is especially in the area of food. And I have here a book, Indian Givers, How the Indians of the Americas Transformed the World by Jack Weatherford. And, this was a bestseller. Let's see, I think this is the 80s. 1988. And this was on the New York Times bestseller list, Indian Givers, How the Indians of the Americans Transformed the World. And it's a very interesting book. It's kind of pop history. It's a little bit on the light side, I think, but it's very provocative. And particularly in the area of food, Weatherford has chapters like, silver and money capitalism, piracy, slavery, and the birth of corporations, the American Indian path to industrialization, and in Chapter 4, the food revolution. The food revolution. The discovery of America set off a worldwide food revolution. New crops that were created by Native Americans. And here, I'm in Pecatonica, Illinois, northern Illinois, the Corn Belt. Corn. Corn was a Native American crop. And corn, very interesting history. Today, there's no real, there's a weed in Mexico that's kind of like corn, but there's no intermediate in modern day corn, or even the corn that was in America when Columbus arrived in 1492, has scant commonalities with this weed that most geneticists say is the basis of corn. And corn is the only plant whose seed pod, the ear, doesn't burst open. That was bred out of the corn by ancient Mexican farmers. Again, you read articles where modern plant people are like, how did they do that? What happened? There's some steps missing in the development of corn, and ancient Mexican farmers performed this genetic feat. Corn dominates the world now, right? Mostly for animal food, but Weatherford notes that in 1492, when Columbus showed up, the foremost farmers, the most sophisticated farmers in the world, were American Indians. In Mexico City, the area of the Aztecs, the Incas were phenomenal farmers, were unbelievable farmers. And throughout the areas of Central, North, and South America, the Europeans had nothing to teach the Native Americans about farming. In fact, it was the opposite. It's corn that conquered the world. And here's just an anecdote that according to Weatherford, there are no accounts of European explorers over the 300 years after Columbus that came upon Native American groups of people anywhere that were emaciated and starving. They were better fed everywhere than Europeans at the time. They had a wider array of more nutritious crops. And, corn, I've been talking about corn, of course, the one I like to talk about a lot is potatoes. Potatoes dominate the world. Potatoes The Incas in the Andes. When Pizarro showed up, the Spanish conqueror, were cultivating over 1,000 different types of potatoes. And potatoes are a miracle crop. Potatoes yield more per acre than any other crop. The highest yielding crop. Now, I don't know, I've read, no cabbage. I don't know. I like to think, I'm a potato guy. And they'll grow anywhere. You can grow potatoes, and the Incas did. The Incas grew them at sea level up to 10,000 feet. They had different potatoes. You can grow potatoes just south of the Arctic Circle, and you can grow potatoes in the Amazon rainforest. They grow anywhere. High yield. If you eat the peels, they're nutritious. You got to eat the peels, okay? So here's a little survival tip for you all. If you're down on it and you're looking at your backyard and you're like, I got to grow something this summer to get through next winter, what do you grow? Potatoes. You grow potatoes. Highest yielding, easy to grow. And of course, that's why Irish cottagers in the 17th, 18th, 19th centuries, on the small plots of land the English allowed them to cultivate, grew potatoes. Here's another thing about the potato. Before the introduction of the potato to Europe, Russia was a vast marginal power because wheat didn't grow well in Russia, too far north, too inland climate. Grain crops didn't grow well in Russia. Then the potato shows up and Russia becomes a world power. That's how that works, the crop theory of history, right? Show me what you grow, or show me what you can now grow. And of course, we all know what vodka's made out of, right? And so the potato brought Russia to the forefront. And again, a Native American crop. It's not just corn and potatoes. Native American crops. Corn, all types. Beans, almost all types, including pinto, lima, kidney, and navy beans, Native American. Red, white, black, and string beans. Squash, all types. Tomatoes, all types. Native Americans grew tomatoes. Potatoes, all types. Cocoa, comes from America. Peppers, all types, were Native American crops. That's what Weatherford's talking about when he talks about a food revolution, the discovery of America. The foremost farmers in the world in 1492 were Native Americans. Now, Weatherford says that Native Americans, that the grain crops that Europeans grew, wheat, barley, oats, rye, that you broadcast the seeds. He says that the Native Americans invented the idea of taking seeds and looking through them and picking the best ones out. Now, I find that a little bit hard to believe. And Weatherford's book was criticized for exaggerating some things a little bit. But still, the foremost farmers in the world were Native Americans. And let me tell you a story about peppers. I have here an article from Time magazine from some years ago, where Time magazine sent a reporter around the world to investigate hot peppers and to find the hottest pepper in the world. What is that, the Clovi, or what is it, scale, right, for hot peppers? And he wrote a big article after he was done. He spent a year. And he was in Thailand, and he couldn't convince the Thais that they hadn't always grown hot peppers. They said, oh, no, we've always had these. No, you didn't. All peppers, sweet, hot, were Native American crops and then spread to the world. There's also, Weatherford has chapters here about the idea of freedom, that the idea of personal freedom, democracy, are Native American in their origins. And it's certainly true that our founding fathers, well, throughout our history, one of the attributes that we assign to Native Americans is freedom. Thomas Jefferson wanted the symbol of the United States, which turned out to be the bald eagle, right? He wanted it to be a Native American with its foot on a crown. He wanted the symbol of the United States, freedom, liberty, to be a Native American. Throughout our history, Americans, the dominant culture, have looked at Native Americans and said, oh, they're free. Now, of course, we were crushing them at the time, taking their freedom away, but we viewed them as exemplars of personal freedom. And it's certainly true that most Native American societies, and again, this gets complicated, because the Aztecs in central Mexico and the Incas in the Andes and the Mayans in the Yucatan were highly stratified, highly civilized peoples. And their central governments were cruel and oppressive. When we think about Native Americans here in the United States, we think about the tribes. That's the term we use, not exactly accurate. The tribes west of the Appalachian Mountains. Those are the historic Indians in American history. And those Native Americans, those tribes, were personally relatively free. You could come and go as you wanted. There was no compulsion in those tribes. There was no sheriff to come and arrest you. Crimes were punished within the clan. Women had more power than, those tribes west of the mountains, the Iroquois and the Illini and the Winnebagos, Ho-Chunk now, and the Potawatomis. These are the tribes we're talking about when we talk about this personal liberty stuff. Women had far more power in those tribes, had far more freedom than the colonial women in the English colonies. And let's say 1750 in the Mohawk Valley in upstate New York. You have a white settlements, and in those settlements, the women had on average 9 pregnancies in their lifetime. 9. Let's go 20 miles west, and there's an Iroquois village. Those women had an average of 3 pregnancies in their life. Now, usually, most commentators think that's an indication of the relative freedom of the women. The idea being, and I think this holds true, that if given their druthers, most women aren't going to get pregnant 9 times. That there's coercion involved in those colonial women getting pregnant 9 times in a lifetime. That's the average. And the Native American women had the autonomy to only get pregnant 3 times in life. Women, especially amongst the Iroquois, right? There was a council of elderly women that had to check off on tribal politics. There was no such thing in the white colonial cultures. So maybe there's something to this. The American concept of freedom is rooted in the observation of Native Americans. There's also the idea that at the Albany Congress during the French and Indian War, 1752 or 1753, in Albany, upstate New York, 9 of the colonies sent delegations. Some people think of it as the First Continental Congress during the war against the French and Indian War. 9 colonies send delegations, and the Iroquois, who are right there in upstate New York, they sent a delegation. And Benjamin Franklin's from Pennsylvania is at that meeting in Albany. And Franklin writes later that this Iroquois chief comes and says, hey, why don't you colonies do what the Iroquois tribes did, the 6 nations of the Iroquois, and form a confederation where there's a confederation, the tribes all send the delegates to a central that has some power. Most power is maintained by the tribes, but they cede certain power to the confederation. That the idea of the colonies getting together in a confederation was an idea they got from the Iroquois. That's what Franklin said. Benjamin Franklin said that. So our politics too, our politics, and again, Weatherford goes through all this. Now, there's controversy about this. There's controversy. I mean, I taught political science a couple of times at Elgin Community College, and of course in a political science textbook, if you talk about American democracy, you go back to England and Germany and Greece, right? Where did American democracy come from? I mean, Weatherford's like, no, no, no. Those were all tyrannies for all intents and purposes, right? The idea of individual freedom and confederations of states and democracy were Native American. The Europeans picked that up here. Democracy didn't come from Europe to America. It went from America to Europe and to the world. Now again, this is controversial, but I kind of like the idea. We're more Native American than you've been led to believe. And again, I don't know, this is an opinion, of course. I said it earlier, that a rediscovery of our native roots, right, I think would help the United States. Not only heal some wounds, but give us insight into the piece of land that we occupy. And so, finally, and of course, you run across the idea the winners write the history, and so that's why Native Americans have been left out, have been diminished in our history. Because let me go back to the original question. How important are Native Americans in American history? Very, very important. I've just sort of touched on some ways that they're important. And finally, I'd like to say that, thinking historically about Native Americans raises serious and fundamental questions about history, about culture, about civilization. I mean, who are the civilized ones? Because, of course, most of American history, the American government has attempted to civilize Native Americans. And oh my God, it's a horror story. I mean, back in the 1880s and 1890s, it was the official policy of the United States government to, and I don't think they use this term, but come on, to destroy Native American culture. They took Native American children from their families by force and sent them off hundreds of miles to boarding schools where they were prohibited from speaking their language, where it was the expressed goal of the government through these schools to beat, literally, in some cases, the Indianness out of these children. It was all-out cultural war. Now, we don't do that anymore. But that's within the living memory of people still alive today. And again, can we adequately incorporate Native Americans after all this history, after all this oppression, conquest, genocide? Can we ever do it right? Can history, and I love history. I love the discipline of history. And that's why I find this Native American lecture to be so difficult and kind of excruciating for me because I don't know what the answer to that question is. Can Native Americans ever be adequately incorporated into American history? I don't know. The effort is being made, but I don't know. And that makes me sad because it's like, oh, American history is flawed and it can't be saved? No, I can't go there. I can't, you know? And it makes me want to redouble my efforts to study Native Americans and Native American influences and to try to revive and, you know, rediscover the Native American roots of the history of the United States. And this brings us to my final point about Native Americans, and that is, concerning Native Americans, the dominant culture is profoundly ambivalent. We admire them as we destroy them. Indeed, perhaps schizophrenic is a better word than ambivalent because it suggests a pathology. The United States dominant culture is schizophrenic when it comes to Native Americans. Amen. Thanks for watching this lecture on Native Americans. Please join me next week for an episode on Christopher Columbus, mystery man of history. If you don't want to miss an episode, hit the subscribe button, which will allow us to create new content. Thanks to all our current subscribers, and I'll see you next week.